I'm Paul Edwards, author of the Mourner's Woods book series, and first and foremost, a monster kid. Tonight I'm watching The Return of Dracula from 1958. Even if you too are a monster kid who grew up watching these kinds of films, don't feel bad if you don't recognize The Return of Dracula. This film is almost completely forgotten, and there's a reason for that. It's not because the film is especially bad, it's because of when it came out. In The Return of Dracula, the story begins in Transylvania. Count Dracula is being hunted by the Transylvanian villagers, and so he has to escape the country. So he kills and replaces a man who is emigrating to the United States. Now we cut to a small town in California, and this family is anxiously awaiting the arrival of their cousin Belloc, who nobody has seen in decades. And we're introduced to our protagonist, who's the teenage daughter in this family. Dracula arrives posing as cousin Belloc and is welcomed with open arms into the family and moves into the family's house as their extended guest. Slowly, over the course of time, the teenage girl is forced to admit to herself what mounting evidence shows her as deaths continue around town and strange supernatural things are happening. She's forced to realize that the cousin that she loves is not who he says he is, and actually is Count Dracula. If that plot outline sounds familiar to you, it's probably because it's the same plot outline as the superb 1943 Alfred Hitchcock film, Shadow of a Doubt. Remember, in Shadow of a Doubt, there was a small town where a teenage daughter was the main character, and Uncle Charlie came to visit and stay with the family. And slowly over time, the teenage girl is forced to admit to herself that this uncle who she loves so much is actually a murderer. Basically, if you take Shadow of a Doubt, add in the supernatural element where the visiting relative is not only a murderer but is a vampire, and subtract Alfred Hitchcock, you come up with this film, The Return of Dracula. It's quite a downgrade. Nobody's comparing this film to the quality of Shadow of a Doubt, but it's the same basic outline. This film, though, often gets knocked as being terrible, and it really is not terrible. It's okay. Considering what it is, a late 1950s drive-in movie, probably one that you might catch as the tail end of a double feature, it's not too bad. They do as well as they can, trying to recreate the gothic elements of vampire movies in a small town in America. They do have scenes where the townspeople are chasing the vampires. There is a pretty good subplot where one of the teenage protagonist's friends is killed by Dracula and transforms into a vampire herself, and the townspeople have to hunt her down. And there are some legitimately creepy moments in this film. There are a couple of things that went against this movie, though. One is that the actor playing Dracula, it looks and feels like somebody's old junior high school math teacher playing Dracula. You know, it's not that convincing. He fits the general description that Bela Lugosi would fit in terms of his physical appearance, but he has nowhere near the menace or the cultured affect that Bela Lugosi did. And, you know, he's a serviceable Dracula, but he's not going to be the definitive film portrayal of the character. And this is never going to be anyone's favorite Dracula movie or anyone's favorite B movie. But it's not that bad. Those factors are not the reasons why this film is almost completely forgotten. The problem was when it came out. The Return of Dracula was released in May 1958. In May and June of 1958, depending on which country you lived in, Hammer Studios released their version of Dracula, starring Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, just a few weeks after The Return of Dracula had come out. And the film in Great Britain was called Dracula, the Hammer film. And when it was released here in North America, to avoid any confusion with re-releases of the old Bela Lugosi film, they titled it Horror of Dracula. Horror of Dracula, which is how I've come to think of that movie. Horror of Dracula is very much a back-to-basics Gothic story set in the 19th century with period sets, period costumes, and reasonably big budget, especially for Hammer Studios, and some powerhouse acting by Christopher Lee as Dracula, Peter Cushing as Professor Van Helsing, and Michael Gough as Arthur Holmwood. And The Return of Dracula absolutely could not compete with Horror of Dracula. It wasn't even fair. It wasn't even fair. They released their movie at the wrong time. If Return of Dracula had come out 6 months earlier, it probably would be remembered at about the same level that I Was a Teenage Frankenstein is remembered. That is, genre fans are very familiar with I Was a Teenage Frankenstein, and it stands out in our memory. Return of Dracula just fades into the background. And as evidence of which film was more successful, I'll point out to you that even now, in this day and age, you can buy a Horror of Dracula t-shirt. Try buying a Return of Dracula t-shirt. It's not going to happen. People remember Horror of Dracula vividly. Nobody remembers The Return of Dracula. So don't feel bad if you have missed it. But if you're into these kinds of films, don't be dissuaded from watching it just because it got overshadowed. It's not The Return of Dracula's fault that it was just, completely outclassed by Horror of Dracula. Standing on its own, Return of Dracula is a serviceable Dracula film. It's one worth catching at least once. Whereas Horror of Dracula is one that, if you're anything like me, you rewatch every Halloween time. So, I'm not saying you're going to enjoy Return of Dracula as much as the Hammer film that overshadowed it. But on its own merits, it's not that bad. Listen, if you enjoy vintage monsters and classic horror, you would love my book series, the Mourner's Woods books. A lot of franchises have characters that return in story after story in different places. I do it the opposite way. I have one location that's constant, this haunted forest, Mourner's Woods, and a completely new cast of characters in each novel. That way you never know who's going to survive from one novel to the next. The stories are all independent stories. They all stand alone. You can start anywhere. You don't have to have read one book to understand another. And I've got ghosts, monsters, fiends, banshees, all kinds of spooks out in the wilderness of Mourner's Woods. My books are available on Amazon.com, and I sell them as cheaply as Amazon will let me. That means 99 cents for an ebook. How can you go wrong? And they're available in paperback and in audiobook too. Listen, thanks for letting me talk to you a little bit about The Return of Dracula from 1958. I'll see you in Mourner's Woods.